How delightful! For the sake of an evening like this, one can fall in love with Petersburg. He didn't answer. I looked at him stealthily, sideways. His face was gloomy and he had an angry expression. Don't you like it? I asked. Boris made a slight gesture of annoyance. It's scenery, he said with disgust. It's the same as at the opera. You call this nature? A strange, dreamy expression had come suddenly into his dark eyes, and he began in a low, jerky, troubled voice. There now, in Little Russia, there is the real spring. Wild berries, white hazel trees are blossoming. The frogs are croaking in the creeks, the nightingales are singing. When it is night there, it is real night, dark with dread, with mysterious passion. And what days there are there now! What sun, what sky! What is this Finland of yours? A mixture of rain and snow. He turned away and became silent. But I understood instinctively that there was something wrong, something unhealthy at work in my friend's heart. And, in fact, from that very evening, Boris began to fret and seem to wilt. I could hear no longer behind the partition his melodious purring. He no longer projected himself like a bomb into my room in the mornings. His usual talkativeness had disappeared. Only when conversation turned on Ukraine would he grow animated, and then his eyes became dreamy, beautiful and pitiful, and he seemed to be looking into the distance, hundreds of miles away. I'll go there for the summer, he would say decidedly. Damn it, at all events I'll get a rest from the cursed Peter. But in the end, he didn't succeed in going there. His office kept him. In the middle of the summer, we said goodbye to each other. I had to go abroad on business. I left him sad, irritated, tired out at last by the white nights, which brought him sleeplessness and a distress bordering on despair. He saw me off at the Warsaw station. I returned in the very middle of a nasty, wet, foggy Petersburg autumn. Oh, how well I recall those first dismal, irritating impressions: dirty pavements, thin endless rain, a sort of grey, slimy sky, and in the background of the picture rough dvorniks with their brooms, hunted-looking cabmen with their rumpled clothes, women with hideous sheepskin galoshes, the hems of their skirts all wet, bilious, angry people with perpetually swollen faces, coughs and spleen. But I was still more struck and saddened by the change that had taken place in Boris. When I came in, he was lying dressed on his bed, which had not been made. His hands were folded under his head, and he didn't rise when he saw me. "How are you, Boris?" I said, seized already by a feeling of presentiment, and I met with a cold, estranged glance. Afterwards he apparently decided to greet me, for he rose as if it were a matter of duty, welcomed me, and lay down again on the bed. With great difficulty, I managed to persuade him to dine with me that night at a restaurant. On the way he was silent, walked with a stoop, had an air of indifference, as though he were being led on a string, and I had to repeat every question I asked. "Listen, what in the world is the matter with you? Have they changed you?" I said, touching his shoulder. He shook my hand off. "Nothing. Only boredom with everything." For some time we walked on side by side without a word. I remembered his musty, neglected room, its untidiness, the dry bits of bread on the table, the cigarette ends on the saucers, and I said decidedly and with real anxiety, "I'll tell you what it is, my dear friend, in my opinion you are quite simply ill. No, don't wave your hands, but listen to what I'm going to say. These things can't be neglected. Have you got any money?" A plan for curing my downhearted friend had quickly ripened in my mind. It was truly a rather ancient, rather trivial and, if you like, a rather ignoble plan. I had merely decided to take him to one of those equivocal places where one sings and dances, where people don't know themselves what they're doing, but are sure that they are enjoying themselves and through this conviction infect other people with the same illusion. Having dined somewhere or other, we turned towards the aquarium at about 11 o'clock so as to get the atmosphere of a spree. I took a swagger cab which whirled us past the insults of the cabman, past the pedestrians all slobbered over with mud. I was supporting the shattered, thin back of Boris. He was as stubbornly silent as ever, only once asking discontentedly, "Where are we hurrying off to like this?" The dense crowd, the smoke, the rattle of the orchestra, the naked shoulders of the women with their made-up eyes, the white splashes of the tables, the red, brutalized faces of the men, all this pandemonium of tipsy gaiety had a quite different effect on Boris from what I was expecting. At my invitation he was drinking, but he was not getting drunk, and his expression was becoming more and more distressed. A bulky, powdered woman, with an ostrich boa round her fat, naked neck, sat down for a minute at our table, tried to start a conversation with Boris, then looked at him in dismay and silently hurried off into the crowd, from which once more she glanced back towards us. And at this glance dread came to me, as if I had become stricken by something deadly, as if someone, black and silent, were standing close beside us. "Let's drink, Boris," I shouted above the noise of the orchestra and the din of the crockery. With his face puckered up as though from toothache, he formed an unspoken sentence on his lips, which I guessed to be, "Let's get out of this." I insisted on driving from the aquarium to another place from which we emerged at dawn in the cold, dark, blue twilight of Petersburg. The street in which we were walking was long and narrow, like a corridor. From the sleepy 5-storied stone blocks there emanated the cold of the night. The sleepy dvorniks were plying their brooms, while the chilled night cabmen shivered and swore hoarsely. Stumbling as they strained on the cords round their chests, small boys were dragging their loaded stools through the middle of the streets. At the doors of the butchers' shops hung the red, open carcasses of repulsive-looking meat. Boris was walking dejectedly, when suddenly he caught me by the arm and, pointing to the end of the street, cried out, "There it is, there." "What is it?" I asked in consternation. "You see, the fog." The 5th stories were drowning in the mist which, like the drooping belly of a black serpent, was descending into the corridor-like street, had stopped halfway and, hugging itself, was peering down as if getting ready to spring at someone. Boris shook my arm and said, with eyes blazing, in a sudden anger, "Do you understand what this is? Do you understand? It is the town that is breathing. This is not fog, it is the breath from these stones with holes. There is here the reeking dampness from the laundries, the smoke from the coal, there is here the sin of the people, their anger, their hatred, the emanations from their mattresses, the reek of their sweat and their putrescent mouths. My curse upon you! Anathema, monster, monster, I loathe you!" Boris' voice broke and rang alternately, as he shook his bony fists in the air. "Cool down," I said, taking him by the shoulders. "Come, cool down, can't you see that you're startling people?" Boris choked and coughed for a long time. "Look," he exclaimed, his face contracted by his cough, and he showed me a handkerchief which he had pressed against his lips, on the whiteness of which I saw a large stain of blood. "It is he who has eaten me up, the fog." We walked back to his lodgings in silence. In April, before Easter, I looked in at Boris one day. The weather was extraordinarily warm. There was a smell of melted snow, of earth, and the sun was shining bashfully and timidly, as a woman smiles when she is making friends again after tears. He was standing by the opening of the double window, breathing in the spring air. As I entered the room he turned round slowly, and on his face there was a kind of tranquil, appeased, childish expression. "It is nice now at home in the government of Poltava," he said, smiling, by way of a greeting. And suddenly it came home to me that this man would die soon, perhaps even that very month. "It is nice," he went on thoughtfully, and, getting suddenly animated, he hurried towards me, seized my hands and said, "Sachenka, dear, take me down to my home, take me, old man. Won't you do it?" "But am I refusing?" "Of course we'll go." And so just before Easter we started on our journey. When we left Petersburg it was a damp, cold day, and over the town a thick black fog was hovering, that same black fog which had poisoned the soul and eaten the body of my poor friend. But the nearer we came to the south, the more excited and joyful my poor Boris became. The spring seemed rushing to meet us. And when we caught our first glimpse of the white-dabbed little huts of Ukraine, it was already in full bloom. Boris could not tear himself from the window. All along the line, large simple flowers, bearing the poetical name of dreams, blossomed in blue patches. Boris told me with ecstasy that in Little Russia one dyes Easter eggs with these flowers. At his home, under the blue caressing sky, under the full but not yet hot rays of the sun, Boris began to revive quickly, as if he were recovering with his soul from some low, clutching, icy nightmare. But bodily he grew weaker every day. The black fog had killed in him something vital, something that gave life and the desire to live. A fortnight after his arrival, he was confined to his bed. All the time he had no doubt that he would soon die, and he died bravely and simply. I was with him the day before his death. He pressed my hand hard with his dry, hot, emaciated fingers, smiled caressingly and sadly, and said, "Do you remember our conversation about the North and the South? It's long ago now, do you remember it? Don't imagine that I'm eating my words. Well, I admit it, I have not withstood the struggle, I have perished. But after me others are coming, hundreds, thousands of others. Understand, they must win the victory, they cannot fail to conquer. Because over there the black fog is in the streets, in the hearts and in the heads of the people, and we come from the exulting south with joyous songs, with the dear bright sun in our souls. My friend, people cannot live without the sun." I looked at him attentively. He had just washed and had combed his hair flat back over his head after moistening it with water. It was still moist, and this gave his face a pitiable and innocent and festive expression behind which one detected all the more clearly the proximity of death. I remember, too, that he kept looking attentively and in apparent astonishment at his nails and the palms of his hands as though they were strange to him. The next day I was called hastily to his bedside to find, not my friend, but only his body, which was passing unconsciously in a swift death agony. Early that morning he had asked to have his window opened, and it remained open. Into the room, from the old garden, crept in branches of white lilac with their fresh, elastic, odorous flowers. The sun was shining. The blackbirds sang out their madness of delight. Boris was becoming quiet. But in the very last minute he suddenly lifted himself up and sat on his bed, an insane awe showed itself in his wide-open eyes. And when he fell again against the pillows and after a deep sigh stretched himself out with all his body, as if he wanted to stretch himself before a long, deep sleep, this expression of awe did not leave his face for a long time. What had he seen in that last minute? Perhaps to the eyes of his soul there had outlined itself that bottomless, perpetual black fog which, inevitably and pitilessly, absorbs people, and animals, and the grass, and the stars and whole worlds? When they were laying him out I could not bear to see his terrible yellow feet, and I left the room. But when I came back he was already lying on the table, and the mysterious little smile of death lurked peacefully round his eyes and lips. The window was still open. I broke off a small branch of lilac, wet and heavy under its white clusters, and placed it on Boris' breast. The sun shone joyfully, at once tender and indifferent. In the garden the blackbirds were singing. On the other side of the river the bells were ringing for the late church service.